The 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination is an eerie echo across time. Why is it that we still don't have the answers from public institutions?
You started with a cover-up in the government on November 22nd, 1963. And you can imagine those people thought at the time something very strange just happened in the public. And the answers that they got were very superficial. As time wore on, the story about Oswald and the old gun up in the 6th floor of the school book depository became kind of a punchline and a joke, the magic bullet and things of this nature. And here we find ourselves at this point in culture looking across 60 years later, and those people who thought, well, at some point this will get resolved. You know, we've had parents and grandparents, and in their lifetimes they didn't see it, and now here we are 60 years later and their kids and grandkids haven't seen it. So whatever the government has locked up in relation to the Kennedy assassination must be a secret that goes to the very heart of the power center itself, and that's why we find ourselves here 60 years later without
Still waiting.
any answers. Yeah, isn't that something?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And for me, you know, it's important too when you think about the generations coming up, because a lot of them, you know, I mean, the Kennedy story was already long time ago by the time I was growing up. So think about people now, you know, and I had to be retro enough to log into it as a story. So at what point is it just going to be something where if there aren't any answers, you know, they're hoping people just forget about what took place?
Drop off.
Yes.
Yeah. What was the aspect of President Kennedy's space program that was called Blue and related directly to this hidden exotic technology?
This is exactly what we're here for tonight,
Yeah.
which is Blue. And Blue is the secret space program. It's something we brought forward on the X series. And for me, when I think about Blue, the discovery of it, all along the way when I was looking into the UFO file, the UAP, all this thing, the information that was coming out, you'd always go back to the names and they always had Blue in them. Project Blue Book, Project Blue Beam, and I thought, you know, we do a lot with steganography on the show. It's actually the X steganography series. And steganography is like cryptography. They use names for a reason, especially to move things through government agencies without anyone catching on. And so Blue, in particular, a program called Blue Gemini happened during the Kennedy administration. And this was Kennedy's attempt to open up and sort of take control back under the executive wing for the space program. And it had fallen into the hands of Project Paperclip scientists over at NASA. So there was a battle and a struggle there. And a lot of those documents have only come out really in the last 10 years. So we haven't had the access that we have now. Now we can really say that there was a secret space program. The code name of the program was Blue, and that the Kennedy, you know, the kind of battle inside of those political structures with President Kennedy was directly related to this exotic technology aspect, which was in the hands of a very elite group of scientists who were operating outside of any kind of idea of law or constitutionality, and who were very rabid anti-Russian. And so they didn't want anything to do with sharing the technology for the world the way that President Kennedy did.
Barely anyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, well, that's the kind of thing where we see that now too, you know. There's a lot of exclusive circles that happen.
Was NASA involved in a cover-up that persisted 60 years later? I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, this is interesting because NASA comes up as two different things on the radar. And just like Blue Gemini, the program I mentioned about President Kennedy, you know, trying to bring out to the public, Blue Gemini is interesting because it's a twin. And so NASA itself has that twin quality to it, where on one hand, it's supposed to be scientific, they're supposed to be exploring other planets and this kind of thing, but it had a military function even very early on. And the people who were embedded in it, for example, setting up satellites and things like that, there was a division called the NRO, which the public didn't learn about for 30 years. So that's the National Recon Office. They ran the satellites. Well, who was up there? I mean, it's NASA. So we've got a lot of secrecy and heavy-duty secrecy up there in terms of what the public is funded through the space program. This is what President Kennedy was getting at 60 years ago, and what we have now, which is largely an entire apparatus in space that doesn't have anything to do with, the public. So they tell us certain things, but they have an infrastructure going on in space that has nothing to do with what they've presented publicly. So it's really, I would call it the privatization of space, and that's, SpaceX and Blue Origin. It's the billionaires in space game, and so that's kind of the trajectory that we're on, which it gets pretty dangerous, actually, after a while.
Yeah. Well, especially the unknown part, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then what's being hidden.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why was this aspect of JFK's secret space initiative program expunged from the official record?
There's a lot to do with the Kennedy administration, which didn't see the light of day until recently. And the main aspects, or the records, are still being held back. There's 5%, and they've said, well, we've let 95% out, leave us alone. The problem is they left all the good stuff in the 5%. So
makes it sound good,
yeah.
95%.
Exactly. Well, you've got almost everything.
Yeah.
Just not the smoking gun,
yeah.
Literally in this case. So we have a lot of tensions when it comes to space and the kind of secrecy that's held. The problem is that the agencies that hold that information, NASA, the CIA, the NRO, the NSA, they aren't used to doing things without a lot of public pressure. And so the name of their game is counterintelligence. And counterintelligence is, we'll give you a false story, and that's how they're trained to take on our foreign adversaries. They give them false stories to lead them astray. But when it comes to hiding the institution, then they get into a whole ball game where they're looking at it and saying, you know what? We've solved this a long time ago, and we had this lone nut assassin, and he killed President Kennedy. And President Kennedy, he was all about the moon landings, and he was really into that aspect of space. And this part they feel they can just leave out because they don't want anyone to dime into this whole idea because it's a secret space program. So we can think about it as a kind of a covert operation. And we have the public overt government struggling with it. So you have two factions operating side by side there. And space seems to be the ultimate secrecy. The UFO thing operates on an incredibly disingenuous and intel-driven narrative front, so that the stories that we get about it don't add up, and in terms of what the government has and what they say they're doing for honest transparency in relation to it. So they have a totally different agenda, and it goes back all the way back to the Kennedy era, oddly enough.
Yeah.
And Kennedy is weird on that because he has a lot of UFO connections long before he goes into the White House. So James Forrestal is the first National Defense Secretary. He is his close friend. He takes him to Berlin after the war when he's a 28-year-old journalist. And what's fascinating for me is they're both Catholic and they're best friends. And Forrestal runs MJ-12, which is, overseeing UFO secrecy for the government. He ends up getting thrown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital. Oh
my gosh.
This is Defense Secretary. And Kennedy is his best friend. When Kennedy gets into the White House, he does a very interesting thing. He goes and visits the grave of Forrestal, and he has a photographer come with him to take pictures of him at the grave of his friend Forrestal. And we can take a look at that picture right now.
Yeah.
Von Braun and JFK, that is 10 days before JFK's assassination. And he's there with the head of our rocket program, von Braun, who is the leader of the Paperclip group.
Yeah.
Very strange indeed, but quite a picture for the ages.
Yeah.
And not one that they traditionally show when it comes to the Kennedy specials and things. They don't want to deal with Paperclip.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
NASA had enlisted through Project Paperclip Nazi rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, who developed the V-2 rockets in Germany during World War II to help create the United States space program. How did this relate to the secrecy around the technology?
Yeah, this is the crux of what we're talking about with secrecy, because the program itself, Paperclip, was not widely known until the 70s, many years after it happened. So after World War II, you know, the Allies go in, and the United States in particular want the cream of the crop of the Nazi scientists. And von Braun is the top of the rocket program. And he, along with someone else named Walter Dornberger, who shows up in relation to JFK later, those are the two that are kind of the cream of the crop of the space program. And in fact, when they get them back as Paperclip scientists, they're reformed Nazis, basically. And they develop NASA. They develop our whole space program. And so Werner von Braun, he's the father of NASA, but he's also an SS Nazi. You know, it's a very interesting set of circumstances when we get into that. And I think they did a lot to say, well, you know, he was under, you know, Hitler and all that, so he couldn't really, you know, express his true desires. And he didn't want to drop V-2 rockets on English citizens, but that's just what Hitler made him do. But we use those guys to build our space program, but then we also develop them into all kinds of different aspects of the government, and this is where it becomes problematic, because Paperclip as a philosophy, the kind of martial philosophy they're bringing with them from this Nazi period, you can imagine, well, they worked under Hitler for 12 years. By the time we get them, are they really going to be, you know, pure and suddenly just pro-America? So a lot of weird things happen when we get the Paperclip Nazis into the American system of government, but their key function is the space program. And so what you see happening there is they start to develop aspects of this breakaway inside the space program, because they've reunited their old command structure inside of it. And technically, you know, they're under the umbrella of the American government, but how much do they want to basically get back to just running the world the way that the Nazis were? So there's a lot of that philosophy, there's a lot of crossover there. How much were they really after American interests? And with von Braun in particular, this is somebody who I would say, when it comes to Kennedy, Kennedy's policies about sharing the secret technology with the Russians, about going to the moon together, a joint space mission, that's anathema to somebody like him. I mean, the Nazis have just killed 25 million Russians. So, you know, they don't want anything to do with a joint program with those guys. And so Kennedy becomes more and more of a target with his vision of doing this. Kennedy also is looking for, ultimately, UFO disclosure. That's what figures into the equation here. So Paperclip becomes then kind of a dark shadow over the American government.
So fascinating.
It's, yeah, I know that's the disturbing aspect of the whole assassination part, because you have him dealing with, you know, dyed-in-the-wool Nazis in NASA, and they have a lot of problems with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It seems like on a presidential level, since Kennedy, they understand there has to be something done to pull the UFO information back under the executive branch. So Kennedy here, 10 days before his assassination, he sends a memo saying, I want to share this. And you can look at the memo. It's a publicly available document. It's not anything secret. And it says, I want to share our UFO file with the Russians, and we're going to do this joint moon mission. And when you look at that, and you think about, you know, what they'd been doing there with the tension at NASA with the Paperclip scientists, and then you say, he's trying to communicate with Khrushchev at that period of time, and they have all these blocks against him doing it. So what Kennedy does It's something very unusual. Maybe he learned it from his dad or something. But he starts to develop a human intelligence network. So this guy is in a cafe, he's reading a newspaper in Washington, D.C. He represents President Kennedy. Someone comes in and puts something into his newspaper, and it is a message directly to bring over to West Berlin. The guy takes a plane to West Berlin, and then from West Berlin, he goes to Moscow. From Moscow, he meets with a Khrushchev representative. Khrushchev's representative gets the message, goes back, and this is how they're doing diplomacy. There's no State Department, there's no CIA, there's nothing. So I think when they were looking at Kennedy on this, they were thinking he wants to share this exotic technology through the UFO file, and he has his own secret network of communicating back and forth. This is outside of everything that we've developed. By the way, the guy wants to destroy and dismantle the CIA. So I think at that point he becomes too much of a problem for the national security state. And I think that's how we ended up here. And so when they have the hearings now in 2023 about UFO, UAP, and they're saying, oh, we're trying to get that disclosure for you, if they don't deal with Kennedy's effort 60 years ago and the fact that he, one of the factors in his removal and in the animosity from the intelligence agencies is over this aspect of the hidden technology, then we have a situation which you'll never get any kind of answer. And all you'll get is, oh, we need to fund all this money and bloat the Defense Department even bigger because there's some anomalous threat and we can't tell you exactly what it is.
So, Daniel, who seized control of the ex-Black budget in 1947 through the National Security Act to create a governmental mechanism finding private corporations take over advanced exotic technologies?
It's that exotic technology again, isn't it? And this is fascinating because 47 is the year. This is the key year if you study it. So we're 76 years out. So we've been living under that system. But that system brings in the National Security Act. And what's interesting with the National Security Act is it was fought over by factions within the White House. And that's Harry Truman. It's the same guy who dropped the atomic bomb. But he didn't like this. He said, well, that's like an American Gestapo creating the CIA and creating these different kind of eavesdropping powers. And the problem with the National Security Act, they needed something to prevent all the spying and everything that was going on. But they went too far. And the CIA, if you look at the setup of the CIA, you have two organizations. One of them is the OPC, which it has this incredibly innocuous title. It's the Office of Policy Coordination. But these guys blow up trains, rig elections, and they do assassinations. I mean, so like policy coordination indeed.
What a nice title.
It really is. The OPC is that function inside of the national security structure that starts to operate outside of constitutionality. And then the CIA gets memos from President Truman saying, get this OPC thing under control. They're going over to Italy, and yeah, we want help with the election so the communists don't get in, but they're like, completely fixing the election. And it's fascinating because he's sending them memos to get the OPC under control. And what happens is the OP merges into the CIA. And when they merge into the CIA, they become the dominant factor. So instead of the CIA gathering intelligence for the president the way that Truman originally decided this was to be done, suddenly we're in a totally different ballgame. And the guys who like to overthrow governments, the guys who, if you're against them politically, will assassinate you, those guys get in power inside of that structure. So when President Kennedy comes in, his first thing that he says is, I can't believe the amount of power the CIA has over the presidency. This is ridiculous. And he's quoted by Arthur Schlesinger as saying, I'm going to take the CIA and smash it into 1,000 pieces. So you can see instantly that that covert world is looking at this guy who's come in, who's a millionaire, and they think, here's this lightweight playboy, and he thinks that he's going to change all the things that we've been laying out in terms of the rule of the world since World War II. And so it's that structure that turns on him, and it's about 3 years of President Kennedy's presidency. That's all he has. And most of that is fighting with the CIA and the different things that they're doing. So when he leaves, we're in the Vietnam War. You know, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they want him to go in and bomb Cuba. So Kennedy he's already developed quite an enemies list on the CIA side. So therefore, when you get into the situation where the public's looking for disclosure, so many years later, the CIA is the obvious place to go, but they're the ones who've kept the records back.
At the same time.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes.
So it leaves us in a very a tricky situation where the same people who are covering it up still, you know, the CIA, it's interesting because they've had investigations over the years. They said, oh, you've done torture, you know, you've been in Iraq, you did torture things, and a slap on the wrist, a few guys get fired, but the CIA has blown up and blown up. They have their own Air Force, you know. When you look at some of these agencies, you wonder about the national security aspect versus the kind of just oppression of free constitutionality. Because take Homeland Security, which didn't even exist until 9/11. So Homeland Security has 250,000 employees. So just think about that stretched across. We didn't even have the Homeland Security. So in 20 years, 250,000 employees.
Yeah.
So the intelligence agencies and their contractors become a very difficult aspect when you're looking from the point of view of trying to get at the truth, because they're masters of obscuring that kind of truth.
They've been doing it for so long.
Yes, right. They're experts at it.
Yeah.
And so counter intel, right? It's a good secondary story. The public doesn't believe the first one. I do counterintelligence, you know. And so that's kind of, I think, where we are now.
Okay.
We come back around to this idea of the breakaway. Now they're at a point where they need to break back in to, you know, they've developed this advanced technology. What are you going to do with it? You can't just sit on it forever, right? So you're going to come back to the public with it, but you have to come back with a story. So a lot of people look for disclosure and UFO disclosure. They call it UAP disclosure now. You know, they have a new name for this, but UFO really is the best description of the whole thing. For me, the story that they're putting out about it is how they get back into it. So it's not, you know, so they roll these guys out and they're intel related again. So they're giving us kind of intel whistleblower knowledge. They're not genuine inside whistleblowers. So that's kind of false disclosure, sideshow. That's the kind of the upshot of the whole thing. In my opinion, what we're looking at is a group that has such advanced technology, needs to roll it out, needs to profit from it, but doesn't really know how to explain how they kept it secret for 80 years while the public funded it, and they kept it completely off the books. So that's not, you know, that kind of transparency isn't something that they can allow. So we're in this situation 60 years later, which is the same thing that Kennedy faced in 1963. So he goes behind the back of the State Department and the CIA, and there are memos now that came out about President Kennedy saying, I want to share our space information with you, the Russians. I'm going to share our UFO file with you, and we're going to go to the moon together. There's going to be no space race, no weapons in space, none of that. And Sergei Khrushchev, who's Khrushchev's son, he goes on the record saying he and my dad, you know, were planning this joint moon mission.
Wow.
Now, at the Kennedy Library, they have the documents that say cooperation with the Russians in outer space. That's 10 days before the assassination that he's giving these directions. So you can see we're in the same tug of war, and it relates again to the system that's operating plus space. So it's like this very uneven combination with not a lot of questions answered.
Yeah.
And this is where we are.
Yeah.
As we sit here tonight.
Oh, it's so wild. Is the government missing trillions of dollars relating the space program, and what do you think happened to the money?
That's really a good question.
Where's
because
the money?
on the record, it's $23 trillion missing. That's a lot.
Wow.
But some of the researchers around are like, oh no, it's 3 times higher than that. But what they can prove, they have a guy, Professor Mark Skidmore, and he's the University of Michigan professor, and he goes and he assigns his student, after he hears about this, And we have a guest on our program who is the Assistant HUD Secretary. She was for many years, Catherine Austin Fitz, and she has been tracking the missing money for decades. And Skidmore was like, I don't believe it. The government can't be missing that kind of money. The Pentagon, are you kidding me? So he sets his students to do it, and he finds there's more money missing. So Fortune magazine and like mainstream publications start tracking this. Where is this missing money? And so between NASA, HUD, and the Pentagon, they cannot find $22 trillion, which is quite remarkable. So therefore, that's going out the back door into the development of some kind of system. And for me, it relates directly to this heavy-duty development in space that we're seeing and the privatization of space. Because it doesn't make sense. You know, there's only so many Ferraris you can buy.
Yeah.
And like fancy houses you can buy. 22 trillion?
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty severe. So where's the money going? I think my best guess after looking at it is that this is all directly space related.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So did the military develop advanced UAP technology, or was it retrieved from craft that were recovered and then re-engineered?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Did we make it or did they make
Yeah.
it? It's the ultimate question. The only thing I can suggest is that there's a third option in there, which is there was another group operating that had advanced technology that didn't, it was extraterritorial. It didn't belong to any particular government. And if you look at the stories that come in from the 19th century of the airship mysteries, there's an author called Walter Bosley who developed something called NIMSA. And he looks back into a German group that were very advanced and came over here to California and created something called the Sonora Aero Club at the end of the 19th century, before the Wright brothers, before all that. And that all of the airship mystery cases from that period are probably these guys experimenting with their craft. So I think you're looking at something that could be, therefore, human technology on one hand, something here from somewhere else on the other, and then the military itself, the incredible advances that they've made behind the scenes when it comes to the UFO file. So I think a traditional story is a crashed saucer happened in 1947, the military goes in and retrieves it, they recover all this technology from it, they become super advanced. That's one possibility. The other possibility is somebody like Tesla gives them that doorway and they develop this technology. But whatever it happens to be the case, there should be the possibility that the technology was already there and somebody was operating it.
Yeah.
Not large scale, but it was already in operation. That's why you get those stories. So somebody has it, and that's the idea of a breakaway then. At a certain point, they almost snub their nose at the public because they've developed the technology to a certain point where they kind of almost don't even, they say, well, I don't even need the public.
Yeah.
I can automate everything through robots, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the danger, I would say. So when we say breakaway, I think it's a danger. It's kind of a dangerous concept because whoever they are, it's a small group with too much technology and too much power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is Project Bluebeam, the so-called false UFO invasion scenario, something that still exists on some government military intel agency or no?
That's a fascinating question. Bluebeam was always like the street legend that at some point, and it's a story that came out that at some point the UN was going to get together and stage a false UFO invasion. And it had been around since the 90s, pretty much. And but Bluebeam, again, there's that blue piece inserted there. It hung around as a theme. Then when you get into 2017, the New York Times starts covering these stories, and they're like, there's a UFO threat. There's a threat here, a threat, threat, threat. And then they developed the UFO threat office. So then Bluebeam started to seem like, well, maybe it's a possible scenario. So could they bring it out to the public and say, well, you know, there's this incredible threat, and we need to call in continuity of government, whatever it happens to be. We need emergency powers to deal with it, plus all your money.
And then some.
Yeah. So Blue Beam is, the technical name, like the street legend idea. And yet, now, when we look into it, we can see the disclosure programs over and over again. They're mentioning this threat aspect, threat. And for me, the threat thing is a dead giveaway that it's a counterintelligence meme that's meant to centralize power. The extent to which they would do it is anyone's guess. And it's interesting because Kennedy was concerned about this in relation to a nuclear emergency. So he funded director John Frankenheimer to make 7 Days in May. And 7 Days in May is about a COG commander who goes off on his own and creates war with Russia and like shoots missiles over there, or he's attempting to, and that he removes the president. So the movie comes out after President Kennedy is assassinated, interestingly enough, and he gave Frankenheimer access to the White House in order to do this. And behind the scenes, when he was talking to people about it, he said, people need to understand how things actually operate and how dangerous it is with the groups that have taken on power to themselves. And what's really amazing is they have Burt Lancaster playing the general, the COG general. And I have this one clip that I've shown on the show where if you look in the background of where he is, he's giving this dissertation of how he's going to take over and everything. And right over his shoulder is Roswell, New Mexico. So it's this really weird steganography in this movie. And you think, people didn't even know what Roswell was. They didn't actually find out about that story till the 80s, even though it happened in the 40s. Because it was, it was this one intelligence guy who kept the secret for 40 years. So it's very strange, that movie, and that Kennedy would help Frankenheimer make it. I think it tells us a lot about the forces that he was up against. And somehow, again, the factors involved exotic technology, space, and excessive secrecy. Over and over again, those three factors show up. That's dark journalism.
Okay. I like it. So, to circle back,
yes,
you've encountered a link between the exotic technology program and Antarctica. How does this relate to JFK assassination and his final speech?
This is the thing that I'm bringing forward, which has never been on the record, and this comes directly from the Blue research that I've done.
Let's go.
Yeah. So Lloyd Berkner was the person that President Kennedy was going to meet at the Trade Mart.
Okay.
And the Trade Mart, on his way to the Trade Mart, he gets assassinated. So no one ever knew about what speech he was going to give. As a matter of fact, for 5 years, the speech was inaccessible, which is very odd. Eventually, the Johnson administration let it out and said, oh yeah, we think this was it. And it was some weird war speech about how we need more nuclear weapons or something. Kennedy would have never given a speech like that. So what speech was he actually going to give? Well, it's interesting. In Berkner's notes, there's a series of things, and I should explain that Berkner is an interesting guy. One, he's a major scientist for the government. Two, he had been in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd during the famous Byrd exploration to Antarctica. We have a number of secret projects involved in Antarctica. Deep Freeze is the one that's most well known. But whatever it is we're developing there, people can't really get a handle on it because how are you going to get any real intel out of Antarctica? What is interesting is that Berkner had been in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd. And so Lloyd Berkner shows up as an odd character. The next place he shows up on the map is he controls the Robertson panel, which is the first UFO examination by the government. They call in their top people. He's sitting right on the top of it. So Berkner, in 1963 at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he's the person President Kennedy is going to meet. And although Kennedy's records, and the speech were scrubbed, Berkner's notes have been unearthed. And what he said was the speech that they were going to give, one, was going to have international implications that were staggering. Now think about, Berkner and Kennedy going to meet him and all the things that Kennedy was doing with space. My suggestion is that it was going to be related either to a joint moon mission with the Russians or related to the UFO file. Because the kind of hubbub around the event, they were going to helicopter in a flag from the White House that had flown over the White House that Kennedy was going to present. This is from the White House notes. So there's only a couple of things on the record about it, but this you can take to the bank. He was going to hand the flag to Berkner before the announcement. And Berkner, his expertise was Antarctica and the UFO file. So that's pretty interesting when you get right down to it, when you're thinking about Kennedy himself. If you just boil it down to the day and what he was doing, he was going to the Trade Mart to meet Lloyd Berkner, Dr. Lloyd Berkner. And Berkner was major in the UFO file. So here's the strange thing about Berkner. Berkner, later on, will encounter this scientist researcher, James McDonald. And he'll meet with McDonald and one of LBJ's aides. They'll get together. And McDonald is obsessed with the UFO file. He wants to know where they've kept the secret records and did they bring everything to Wright-Patterson, you know, all this kind of talk. Berkner has that meeting, and then 3 weeks later, he goes to D.C. He goes into a fast food place, has a hamburger, goes up to give a speech, and dies. So there's a lot of that type of activity around this subject. And you know, I think when we study Berkner's history, we're connected directly to Antarctica. So the thing that I found when looking for links with Antarctica and the Kennedy assassination is the weirdest one, which is that the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository, this is on the record, is named D.H. Byrd, and he's the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who discovered, you know, did all the explorations to Antarctica. So D.H. Byrd, they called Dry Hole Byrd because of his oil explorations. He's the one who's funding all the Antarctica expeditions. So when you get into the assassination zone with President Kennedy, Lloyd Berkner has been to Antarctica and spent all this time with Byrd there. Kennedy's going to meet him. The person who owns the Texas School Book Depository, where they're going to sit this patsy in it, he's D.H. Byrd. He's Byrd's cousin. So there's an Antarctica stamp. And, you know, we had a guy on the program, John Warner IV, and he is the son of Senator Warner, the late Senator Warner of Virginia. And his stepmom was Liz Taylor. And his dad was a part of MJ-12, which is the committee that controls the UFO file. And he said, I tried to nail down my dad about what he was doing in Antarctica and deep freeze, because he would take me on all these different trips with him, but he would not take me to Antarctica. And he said, all I can tell you, son, is it's about space. So that's what we get when we go into Antarctica in relation to this. But there are people who are going on the record in relation to these things. And Warner, you know, his dad was in a position to know. He was the Secretary of the Navy. He was the senator for 2 decades in Virginia. And, you know, he went through that whole neocon war machine with Bush and Cheney and those guys. So, you know, his public profile is kind of that of a hawk in a way. But there he was giving that intel to his son. You know, I can't tell you the whole thing, but, you know.
Key word.
Yeah. And Liz Taylor was really into UFOs, by the way.
So Warner says, every day.
Can you imagine having Liz Taylor as your stepmom?
Yes. Ugh.
What a life.
Yes. Will we ever get the truth from the government? The true story of JFK's assassination? Will they release the CIA records? And will the UFO file secrecy aspect be understood?
You know, it's a great question. It depends largely on the public. But no, the agencies themselves, the government will never give them the truth on it. And they had an opportunity for 60 years to do it. You'll never see it. But what can happen is those pieces can be put together by a citizen committee, and the government, certain elements in the government can give them investigatory abilities. So in that sense, you could get some closure around the assassination. But the problem is, I think, with the Kennedy assassination, and why they're even more willing to talk about other things that are embarrassing to the government, is that the records somehow of the JFK assassination go strike right at the heart of what we call the deep state. And so that control structure has two aspects to it. One, at one point, the intelligence agencies turned on their own commander-in-chief. That's a pretty major story, but two, the reason that they did it. So who has the power to do it, and why did they do it? This is exactly the question that you asked. For me, the UFO aspect, the UFO file aspect, is crucial in terms of Kennedy disclosing it to the Russians. Now, here's where I think I get a little support for that position. We have on record the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, who was friends with E. Howard Hunt, who was the top spy master CIA guy during Kennedy's administration. Now, he got caught bungling into the Watergate Hotel and trying to steal records for the DNC. And so that's where Watergate and that whole story comes from. It's the only reason we even know this guy's name. So Douglas Caddy was his best friend. And he called him in and said, represent the Watergate burglars. And Caddy, before E. Howard Hunt got sent to prison, had a meeting with him talking about his family and, what am I going to do and all that kind of stuff. And he said, before he left him, he said, before you go to prison, can you tell me one thing, like, why was Kennedy assassinated? And E. Howard Hunt said, John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give this country's most vital national security secret to the Russians. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And he leaned forward and he said, the UFO file. So he was going to share the alien presence, as it were. That's the top secret inside the US government. And so this isn't some CIA guy telling a story. This is him talking to his friend in private. And then we have, Caddy, who is the Watergate lawyer, a historical figure. This guy's maybe 84 years old now, and we've had a number of conversations. But he's gone on the record with me on this. And so that's a major disclosure and indicates that Kennedy was, in fact, murdered over the UFO file. It makes sense. It actually brings a lot of the secrecy into focus when we have that. And so that's my conclusion on it. And then Caddy's story, and then Kennedy's memo, there's a lot of points that really point to that. So after the 60 years of secrecy, I think the thing that we can say is Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. If you go back to how the FBI categorized the UFO file in the beginning, they called it X. And that's where the whole thing about the X-Files, the TV show, and all that came from. It's, this is the FBI definition for it. And it's weird because the people involved all go back to Kennedy, and that's what really intrigued me over the years, is whenever I would go into searching out NASA or the UFO file, Kennedy always showed up. So in the case of X, they had someone named Guy Bannister who was a field agent in the FBI, and he became the chief of their Chicago office. This guy created the X file, and he researched the cases. There's like newspaper shots of him with, somebody who saw a UFO. So he's the early development guy. He's the same person who in 1963 in New Orleans is training Lee Harvey Oswald, who they're going to say is the Kennedy assassin, to infiltrate student groups by pretending to be a Marxist. And they say, well, really act like a communist, and we're going to weed out who's a communist, because Bannister himself is super right-wing. So what's interesting is Oswald, as the assassin figure, he gets set up doing all this. And so by the time they grab him in the Texas School Book Depository, he has this incredible record of acting like a Marxist because he's been working for this guy, Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is the one who developed the SMX, X technology protocol for UFOs. So it's a weird interface between these people. You start to feel like they're an interlocking network, shall we say. And the odd thing that shows up in biographies of Oswald, which people still can't explain, is when he's working, stacking books for $1.25 an hour at the Texas School Book Depository, he's telling everyone, I'm going to work at NASA. this is what they remember. They're like, well, he said he was going to get a job at NASA. You know, so we missed an important chapter of who this guy was.
Yes.
You know? He's supposed to be this disgruntled guy who hates the United States, and he loves communism, and he's just so lucky that President Kennedy drives by his window and Oswald gets to shoot out the window. It's perfect timing, right? Oswald only had the job for 6 weeks. So what are the odds of him getting into this building, hating the it doesn't seem very likely. Whenever you go back into that historical aspect of the story, it gets more and more ridiculous, you know. And the UFO aspect is interesting whenever you get around the Kennedy case. You're looking at the first murder case of a president. That was Jim Garrison was the guy who prosecuted the murder of President Kennedy, and he kept running into all this weird aerospace parts. He's like, well, you know, this is supposed to be an assassination by, you know, this communist who hated Kennedy for his policies, but now everyone I'm running into around this guy is an aerospace person, and they work at McDonnell Douglas, or they work at NASA, or he says he's going to work at NASA. So this is all part of the problem with the case, which is the aerospace side has been ignored for a long period of time. And if you don't study the aerospace side when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, you miss out on two major things in terms of public disclosure now around the UFO file and then around the Kennedy assassination, which is aerospace is sitting right in the middle of it, and the aerospace interests. So Garrison, after he presses the case, he decides, and it's a very famous interview that he does with Ramparts magazine, which was like Rolling Stone back then. And he says, you know, originally I thought it was Texas Oil men, but what I learned was that the aerospace companies had their own wing of assassins, and they were the ones who put together the assassination. That was his conclusion, and he was the guy who prosecuted the case. So yeah, we're in a remarkable situation there where the person who prosecuted, and they made the movie JFK out of Garrison's life, which is where we get all the, you know, the different congressional hearings and things about Kennedy in the 90s. And Oliver Stone makes the movie about Garrison. But Garrison is the guy who said, you know what, the aerospace companies were the ones that were involved. And the reason that they did it was, you know, this is the great question that he had. Why did they do it?
Yeah.
And I think if you put together that research with the UFO research, then you start to say, oh, Kennedy is a threat because he's exposing their pet project, the ultimate exotic technology project. So that puts him, you know, you might say Kennedy was on the radar to be assassinated for a number of different reasons, but the aerospace aspect is the aspect that you can't ignore.
Yeah. So are U.S. presidents read into the UFO file, or which commanders-in-chiefs were aware of the actual exotic technology?
There's been a major tension since day one on the UFO file and the presidents. And this goes back to Harry Truman. Now, it's interesting because Truman, when he's president during Roswell, he's president during the Aztec crashes. He's there in the middle of the Kenneth Arnold UFO flying saucer craze. So he's the first president that has to deal with it publicly. And what's interesting is if you go back on Harry Truman to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, he was the senator in 1941 when there was a large-scale crash, way before Roswell, right before Aztec. So we're looking at a different era that he comes out of, and he was a natural fit for this. He'd already dealt with the secrecy around a UFO crash. And he's the one who developed the Majestic 12 group to handle this, and he put Vannevar Bush and various scientists. Truman moves through that period, hands it off to Eisenhower. Well, Eisenhower is very interesting because he handles it and says, we need to get this ramped up, this technology. We've just fought World War II. We need to be #1 with the UFO secrecy and make sure none of it gets out. So the group that's in the background during the Eisenhower administration figures out we need to kind of remove this from presidential control. And the way that we can do it is by putting it into corporate hands which don't have the ability to track back through government and in fact keep private records of the corporation, which can't be, gotten at in a legal situation. So the government is always vulnerable on that side of secrecy. And somewhere it's kind of understood during that period of time, the Eisenhower administration, is when the UFO file slips from government control by the president to this other thing. The Ex-Protect group takes over, and their tentacles are in the government, but they actually reside inside of a corporate, quasi-corporate political structure. So they're half defense contractor, half CIA. So Lockheed Martin is the best candidate for this as a defense contractor. Still making tons of money in wars at our expense. Whenever there's a major war, you're going to find Lockheed or Boeing right in the heart of it. So by the time you get to Kennedy and then the speech by Eisenhower, on his way out, he says we need to watch out for the military-industrial complex. It's fascinating because Eisenhower was in charge of, our whole command as a general during D-Day, World War II, and everything. He's warning against his own military. That's a gigantic move just before he hands off the baton to JFK. And he says to JFK in private, this is what I know about the UFO file. You need to get it back under executive control. Kennedy, when he gets into the White House, says, I can't believe how much CIA has control over everything that we're doing. And what we need to do is dismantle the CIA. And so this sets up the tension for the 3 years, very short presidency of President Kennedy. And in that period of time, he goes to battle against the CIA when they try to get him into a war in Cuba, for example. And then he had announced a joint moon mission, not Americans go to the moon by themselves. So we, with the dreaded enemies of, that kind of Nazi piece that had ingratiated itself into NASA after World War II, then he wants to go to the moon with the dreaded enemies of these people. They don't want to share that advanced technology. They don't want to share the UFO file with the Russians. They don't want the culture to learn from it. And Kennedy's assassination, we've learned from a number of different positions. The Central Intelligence Agency was against him, the Federal Reserve, these other things. But really, the UFO file is the deal breaker because the advanced technology is their entire plan going forward. And that whole thing, which was developed actually in Nazi Germany, of ruling things on the ground from space, it actually comes out of a rocket program in Germany. So we inherited it and bolstered it as part of our own national security state. Here we are in the middle of that, and you find yourself surrounded by a tremendous amount of space secrecy. Now, when you move through those presidents, and we'll do it very quickly, when you go to Reagan, he's in the middle of looking at images by a scientist named Norm Berggren, who shows him craft inside the rings of Saturn, sort of camouflaged. This is what he's looking at, is security footage. And so Berggren describes, this briefing, and he eventually wrote a book called Ringmakers of Saturn about these craft that were hanging out around Saturn. So it sounds pretty far out, but Reagan's looking at it as scientific data. And this is, again, this period of time where Reagan starts to talk very strangely at UN hearings and in meetings about the UFO file. If there's an alien threat, he tells his Russian counterpart, will you join with us? So in the middle of this period, he creates a program called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is a massive program from space to disable any weapon on Earth. And SDI becomes nicknamed Star Wars after the movie, and trillions of dollars are put behind it. We should say billions that secretly turn into trillions of dollars. What happened is that this brings the Russians to the table of negotiation because they say, what are you doing with this advanced stuff in space? And that brings about this massive reduction thing, and then SDI it seems like it goes away. Well, there's some joint program there that when we developed SDI, what actually happened is we attracted more attention from whatever this other thing was. And that's when you see all of the UFO sightings and all of these things go off the charts. So we're in the middle of his presidency. He's saying to people, well, I actually chased a UFO, with Air Force One. There's a pilot that's gone on record about it. He has Steven Spielberg at the White House, and they debut the movie E.T. And he says, you know, everyone in this room knows that's not fantasy. This is what he's saying in the middle of all this. So Reagan is very, very aware on the UFO file side. Unfortunately, the CIA has such a presence in that period that they convince him everything UFO-oriented is a threat, and that they need to build up, you know, Star Wars and all these types of things. When you move through those periods into Bush and Obama and all the rest of it, they do a good deal to keep it completely under wraps. They don't want even Reagan-style talking at the UN about aliens. They keep it very under wraps. And it is the Trump presidency where they run into problems again in the national security state. Now, this is a very non-political statement, but I can tell you the main problem that the deep state players have with somebody like Trump is his uncle. Because Trump's uncle was John Trump, Professor John Trump, and he worked with Vannevar Bush. In fact, Vannevar Bush, is something I put on the record, was the protege, John Trump was Vannevar Bush's protege. So if you go through those records, you'll find a very unusual thing, that Nikola Tesla's records, when he dies in 1943, the FBI orders in a scientist to go inspect those papers, looking for information about taking down flying objects at a distance. This is a crucial piece. The person they send in is John Trump. John Trump, working with Vannevar Bush, knows a great deal about the UFO file. He knows a great deal now about the Tesla information. That information goes underground. The astronaut Gordon Cooper, years later in a bio, says, not only are UFOs real, I've seen them, I've seen the films, the government has covered it up, etc. But he says that in the Tesla papers, the thing that they became afraid of was the information in there also related to a similar type effect that I was talking about with apotheum. So they were worried that the Russians had the information through Tesla, and that basically that Tesla had been spied on. That's where SDI came from. So both of them are suggesting there's unlimited technology inside of the UFO file and the Tesla work, and that there's a crisscross there. The person that's at the apex, who knows both about the secrecy about the UFO file and the Tesla files, is John Trump. Well, recently you have Trump out there, you know, and he's talking along, and they have this guy, they're suggesting Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be his running mate. Well, this guy in Iowa during the campaign starts talking about the UFO file. And he says, you know what? We should release all these UFO files to the public. Then he appears with Trump at a campaign event. Trump goes up to the microphone, I kid you not, and starts musing about his Uncle John. Oh, Uncle John, if Uncle John could be here, you know, he told me so many secrets. Uncle John this, Uncle John that. If you go and you actually look at it and take yourselves outside of the geopolitical news spin around all this, you get a real snapshot of the UFO file wars when you see Trump out there on one hand talking about this, and then you see the CIA out here on the other hand talking about it. There's the clash, and you know, those people can't stand each other.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you talk about Trump in certain circles, you have to peel people off the ceiling. There's a reason for that that goes far beyond the whole loudmouth real estate person. Though deep state people don't appreciate people on the same level looking and dealing with them. And this is the nature of where we find ourselves with it. Wherever someone comes down on the political side, look at the background of Uncle John Trump, professor at MIT, the protege of Vannevar Bush, who ran the UFO file, who investigated Tesla's secret work. The crisscross there is undeniable. There's a big opening for understanding the UFO file wars.
There's so much more to dig into. Well, so what is the historical timeline of the UFO file and the secret space program?
Crucial question. You know, the timeline works traditionally from 1947. And like I said, we'll go with it, but Cape Girardeau happens in 41. But when you get to the question of the secret space program, one of the key things that happened for us to understand that there is a secret space program is they had a hacker into NASA This happened around 2002. The guy's name was Gary McKinnon, and boy, did they want him bad. He was in the UK, and he still is around now. You know, he doesn't really talk too much about it, but they wanted him over here, and because he had Asperger's, there was some kind of a deal made where he could stay in the UK as long as he stopped hacking into NASA. While he was hacked into NASA, he saw an off-world officers list. The off-world officers list was people who were operating as astronauts in deep space. We don't know anything about this program at all. So NASA never talks about it. They don't have a program like that, so who's running it? Those are the things that he found out about. And he also, you know, there were certain groups called Solar Warden. These are the things that he went on the record about. Later, we got more documents out of the government saying, oh yeah, well, we are operating things in space that we try to keep secret. The NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, they kept their actual office secret from 1960 until 1993. So it is possible to have an agency doing all this, like the Secret Space Program, without it being a public thing that you and I know about, funded by this deeper system. The problem is the disconnect from the public having any oversight about it. So that's really where we find ourselves as far as the timeline goes. There's no real disclosure around the Secret Space Program, and there's no real disclosure, for example, about the 50 years of manned space history from 1972 to 2024.
That's so wild.
It's, yeah, SSP for short. And it's interesting because, you know, we've done conferences on the Secret Space Program. And, you know, there's a weird kind of comic book version of it that Gaia TV runs, is like sidelining with this hard, deep state geopolitical analysis, which includes financial analysis about secret systems of finance. And Gaia TV's thing is like, oh, it's a secret space program, you know, there are kind of triangle head aliens out there, you know, whatever it is. So there's an entertainment thing that slowly kind of shadows the secret space work. What that tells me is the ability to discredit it is, the effort to discredit it is operated by the same groups trying to hold that technology under wraps.
So your UFO research is very different from others in the field, as we all know and appreciate, because specifically you mentioned mystery schools and secret societies being involved. What is that connection?
In my opinion, this is the crucial aspect that's been missing in the analysis around the UFO file, and it can open it up for all of us. So if we look at mystery schools, there are public mystery schools, and there's a wave of this that happens in the late 19th century. So we'll look at it through the figure of Rudolf Steiner. Steiner starts the Anthroposophical Society, and he's a mystic, he's a scholar, and he incorporates all of these things that we know now. Biodynamic farming, for example. This is the guy who came up with eurythmy and a number of different real innovations. This guy was no lightweight. And one of the incredible things that he put on the record was that there was advanced technology breaking in to the timeline, so that by the time we got to the 21st century, in fact, there would be almost like an astral force that was coming in through the technology. This is very odd language for that period of time. Also, his descriptions, I looked at a lecture of his, for example, from 1920. Basically sounds like he's describing the internet in great detail. But he talks about this thing called the eighth sphere. And the eighth sphere, if you take it from 1920 to 2024, sounds exactly like meta or virtual reality and those types of things. And he talks about the kind of invention there of beings. So the eighth sphere beings sound very much, in fact, like what we're seeing in reports, alien grays and things of that nature. So that's one large hint that they were trying to put something out there through the mystery schools and let the culture know, inform the culture along the way. If you go into the work of Aleister Crowley, he talks to a figure named Lamb. And Aleister Crowley's known as like this famous, black magician and all the rest. But if you look at those pictures of Lamb, it looks exactly like what we call an alien gray now, with the large head and all the rest. So there are hints there in this literature, and they start referring back to a time in prehistory when humanity possessed the technology. This is the fascinating curveball in all of it, which is that it's an old technology that has been rediscovered by humanity. And they don't attribute it, it's not like there's some ET force coming in. The mystery school aspect is fascinating also because the people who study the UFO file, for example, J. Allen Hynek, a very famous researcher, was involved with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he was originally part of Project Blue Book, and then he realized the government was shafting the public, and he said, I'm going to bring this information out. At a certain point in time, he says, the answer to the UFO file can be found in Steiner's work on theosophy. And if you look at Steiner's work on theosophy, you're going to find a number of things about the eighth sphere and these elemental beings. A lot of the theories that get traded around now of plasma beings, this is becoming almost mainline science. So when you get into this, you start to see that people involved very deeply with the UFO file and NASA, like Jack Parsons, for example, were close companions with Aleister Crowley. Well, Jack Parsons is the father of our rocket program, and you have this occult imprint all around the space aspect. Whenever you get around NASA, you're dealing with occultists, you're dealing with Masonic imagery. Over and over again, they schedule the dates in a very occult or Masonic fashion. And it's been really well tracked to such a point where they said, we're going to stop even, guessing at this. They would bring Masonic flags up to the moon and things of this nature. The Masonic thing comes out of an occult mystery tradition as well. So when we're looking at space, we're looking at a whole kind of mysticism and religion that goes far beyond, hey, these guys have advanced technology. The technology is crucial, but you might start to realize when you study it that there's something coming through, the action of coming through the technology. This is the whole thing when they talk about interdimensionals and things of this nature. Well, there's a gigantic, collider, Hadron Collider, out there at CERN, and the whole point of this thing is to smash all these particles together so that they can open up into other dimensions. This is what it's all about. Well, the thing is funded every year billions of dollars, and who's behind that? One of the unusual things that they said they were trying to do in the middle of CERN, when they got questioned about it, was communicate with other dimensions. So we find ourselves, when you get around the scientific aspect, around the UFO file, you're dealing with a large-scale astral and mystery piece, which has nothing to do with what we hear about, traditional reports. There's a fast ship, this thing took off faster than lightning, or I was abducted, or anything like that. This is more along the lines of going into the mysteries of apparitions and things of that nature. There's a gigantic crisscross with it, and it's interesting because the first person who brings the UFO file online is Kenneth Arnold. He's the one who's in Mount Rainier and he sees these flying saucers. So when he's done giving this news report out, he goes into the city and he shows up at a hotel room and he says, oh, I'd like to get a room, and they say, your room is all ready for you. And so this gets very unusual, but the upshot is this. All of these unusual things happen to him, and then he starts to get calls while he's in this hotel room from people who are telling him everything that he did the day previously in minute detail. Whenever you get around the UFO file, you get around this other almost supernatural aspect. And there's a number of researchers. John Keel was one famously. He wrote the Mothman Prophecies, which they made into a movie. And it captures his activities of going and studying a UFO wave when he was in West Virginia, and the number of unusual things that happened to the people involved, including the fact that whenever he was down there, he was getting calls from an electronic voice telling him, this is what's going to happen to you tomorrow. So whenever people get into the real study, you're starting to deal with a very spooky aspect. When you deal on the mystery side, in the mystery school aspect of this, Steiner's work was all about this is an astral phenomena. And that's what we really need to look at. And that in the 20th century, the great challenge for humanity was going to be this astral phenomena coming through the technology. That's how you get, the idea of AI manifesting as a being, or, cybernetics, whatever it happens to be, the creation of this ultimate cyborg, This has a very old mystery tradition attached to it. And that's, the occult imagery is undeniable.
Well, so let's go a little deeper on Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy.
Yes.
What is Armin and the eighth sphere beings?
Yeah, that really crisscrosses with what we were just talking about. And it's interesting because I'm glad you brought the eighth sphere back up. One of the key functions of the eighth sphere is advanced technology. So here's this guy who's a mystic looking out into our future in the 1920s and telling us you're going to be facing more and more wars, you're going to be facing more and more materialism. And he tracks back the story and he says, in 1840, there was an incredible movement towards scientific materialism. And a number of these schools who had kept secrets for decades, centuries, from the public, relating to advanced technology, the actual past, things of this nature. Arcane secrets were, in fact, came together and said, humanity is not going to be recognizable in 100 years. This whole thing is going to be over. So we have to let out some of the secrets that we've been keeping all these years. And then you find these weird waves of spiritualism coming in the 1860s. Abraham Lincoln was caught up in it. And there's a whole phenomena of seances and things of this nature. There's a gigantic wave that happens there. No one really can explain it. Suddenly in 1875, Helena Blavatsky shows up. And Blavatsky is very interesting because she's from Russia, and she says, I'm going to found the Theosophical Society. It's all reincarnation. It's all psychic experience. It's all life after death, and it causes this incredible harangue in the culture, so much so that by the time you get to the 1960s, all that stuff is embedded. But it all comes from the Theosophical Society. Steiner himself came out of the Theosophical Society. So there's a wave there that was trying to instruct the 21st century about what we were stepping into, the period we were stepping into.
Well, and how can what he wrote in the 1920s be applied to describe this in relation to the UFO file?
That's it. If you look at him talking about eighth sphere beings, advanced technology in the eighth sphere, a kind of virtual reality, then we start to kind of update it. When you look at it, what is he describing? He's telling us, in fact, that there's going to be an incredible web of beings that are attached through the technology. And so in the deep state, they have all kinds of groups that deal on the occult side. In fact, many of them are known to be Crowleyites, in fact. Steiner described two types of mystery schools. There's a right-hand mystery school, sounds very much like X-Share to me. And then there's a left-hand mystery school. That's more like a black magic kind of thing. That sounds a lot like X-Protect. And it's interesting because he talks about America in 1920, and he said the entire political situation is ruled by various occult mystery groups and secret societies. That's his estimation of it back then. Over the course of 100 years, and we hear a lot of things from Bohemian Grove and to a number of other different scenarios, what is it that they believe in, the people who are ruling the planet? That becomes the core question. And I think Steiner's giving us that window through this description of Ahriman, who is basically the personification of advanced technology and AI, but with a very kind of evil purpose. And it's interesting to me that he's the same guy that, you know, when people send their kids off to Waldorf schools and they get that advanced education, that's all Steiner. Steiner invented Waldorf schools, biodynamic farming, all these different things. So when he comes into giving us these predictions, we basically look at it and we say, well, you know, so much predictions, I don't know how, if you believe in them or not. And yet some of us possess the ability to look into that future and see what's coming for humanity. This is the difference that Rudolf Steiner makes. That's where the mystery trail crisscrosses directly with the UFO file. Because again, you're in the field of mystery.
So, since we're in esoteric territory here, what is astral agency, interdimensional UFO, UAP visitations, and contactees?
This is fascinating. When you look at reports dealing with men in black, for example, there's always a kind of a supernatural feature that goes along with them. There's a famous story of Dan Aykroyd, who had set up, he was doing a UFO show for Sci-Fi, which suddenly got canceled. And he went downstairs and he recounts this whole story that he was talking to Britney Spears on the phone and he was going to book her for Saturday Night Live. And he's looking out and there are these guys in black suits looking at him, staring at him. And he was like, that's very strange. Like, who are those people? And they disappear. Now, that's Dan Aykroyd. It's just a celebrity story. But I can tell you, when you backtrack that story over and over again, it comes up. People in the very earliest cases of the UFO file, like Maury Island, report getting these visits, and that became where the whole Men in Black mythos came from. But what's fascinating to me is very often their appearance, they looked in some fashion Asiatic. So one of the researchers in the period, John Keel, said I have to get to the bottom of this, because he had studied all these different stories about it. And they acted very strangely. Very often they would do things like show up out of nowhere. And it seemed like they had some kind of astral interdimensional ability. So there's a supernatural factor goes along with them. Interestingly enough, he decided that he would get a photo of all these different groups and he would show them to people and say, what actually looks like the Men in Black? So he'd show them people from Alaska, he would show them, you know, Hawaiians, he would show them people from the UK. He went through all of them, and they all stopped on Sami people. And the Sami people are an indigenous group in Finland, Sweden, and they were very well known for very advanced psychic abilities. But their appearance was over and over again what was cited. And he said when he showed the various photographs to the people who had seen the Men in Black, it wasn't that 5 or 10 or 15% had identified the Sami. He said that all of them had, unanimously. So I went back and looked into the history of the Sami, and I found they were well known, respected, and feared in a number of ways. And you know, there's many popular figures who are Sami. Renee Zellweger is a Sami, and they have a beautiful appearance, and it's an amazing culture, fascinating. But what's interesting to me, when going back into their histories, is they were well-known and feared shamans. So they had this incredible kind of mystical reputation. There was a whole program to import the Sami into America in order to train reindeer. I kid you not. This is their whole thing. They brought them into Alaska. The connect that I made is that the same group that had these incredible astral abilities were used and utilized by the government for a mind control style operation because they had astral abilities. That's what the astral agency aspect is inside of the X-Protect group. That's where you get the kind of fantastic happenings. And a number of people involved in the contactee style movement, when I talked about the apotheum effects that take place, you're dealing with a supernatural factor again. So people who can astrally project make a lot of sense. It's a very interesting place for us to arrive at.
What a skill like, to just hone in on.
And yet we know that the government studies remote viewing, has funded it millions of dollars every year, trying to find out how to develop psychic spies. But they've also tried to use psychics to do what? Operate UFO craft. There's a whole program involved. So it is, and I understand the nature of the questions are so big and so out there, and yet there's very good foundation. So for me, if you leave out the supernatural aspect, you're not going to get anywhere.
All of it, yeah. Okay.
The psychic mystery school aspect has got to be included.
Does NASA train its astronauts in the development of psychic powers, or like how was Werner von Braun's ESP testing program? Like how did that all work?
This is really fascinating and on the record. Here's what I found out from Russell Targ, who ran the SRI remote viewing program, and who was a physicist who developed remote viewers for the government and for the CIA before he figured out, oh, the CIA is a bad outfit to work for. He said that in the early development of SRI, Werner von Braun, who was the father of the space program that we got from Nazi Germany, came to him and said, can you develop an ESP machine for me to test the psychic ability of an individual? And Targ said, oh yeah, I can develop that program. I can make a machine of images of things. Who was it for? And von Braun said, this is for the astronauts that we want to send into space, because they're going to need psychic ability in order to be the kind of astronauts that we want to send. So he developed the machine. There's still a version of it that's available now. And whenever we get around the space program, again, there's a mystical aspect. There's a number of stories involving the astronauts, the moon landing and things of that, that when they got to a certain place over the moon, they started to see their own dead relatives. You don't hear that story too much.
No.
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 You know, there's a lot of wild theories about the moon, but you don't hear, well, the astronauts were seeing dead relatives. This is very unusual. And then von Braun, who's heading up the program, is saying, on a psychic basis, develop this psychic machine for me. What you learn if you penetrate deep into the stories around the UFO file is that in order to activate the technology that they redevelop, they seek out and develop and train psychics for that, which is what we started with in the beginning of our interview tonight. And for me, this is a crucial aspect, that there's no operating, we can talk as much as we want about technology, crash technology, advances, and all the rest. If you don't have a psychic aspect involved in the technology transfer of redeveloped craft, you can't operate it. That's what we're finding out, and I think the von Braun story really illustrates that.
Yeah. No, it really does. So what is the UFO file secrecy policy of the Space Force, NASA, NRO, and commercial space corporations like SpaceX?
SpaceX, yeah. Well, Elon Musk, he's gone on the record saying, UFOs aren't real, we're here alone, I need to bring consciousness to Mars, the light of Mars. So thanks, God, I appreciate that. We get a lot of that arrogance in the space programs generally. But I will say when it comes to commercial groups, they are under NDAs. So there's nothing, and I mean nothing, that Musk says in relation to space that isn't sanctioned by the US government. So let's go back to the government policy. Same policy with NASA. They did a number of photographs of unusual artifacts on the moon and on Mars. And there was a guy that they had who was a photo expert, and his job was to scrub those artifacts from the public photos. So they're looking at one set of photos, we're looking at another set of photos relating to, the mysteries of Mars, Phobos, and others. So when you think about it from this perspective, there's an entire program where they keep this knowledge in relation to what they're doing with the secret space program. We here, somewhere way down here in the middle of it all, we're supposed to just accept what they have to say. So all of those groups, NASA, on the private, on the government side, and on the private commercial side, SpaceX, they're under the same rules of the government, which is don't say anything we don't say.
Thanks, Elon.
Unfortunately.
Thanks, Elon.
Can you imagine how many NASA UFO pictures that they have that we've never seen? Think about it. They have a 24/7 feed in outer space. We've never seen it.
That's so wild to me. Well, then, so looking ahead with the space as the focal point of technology and commerce, what is the future of Apotham research and UFO file disclosure?
This is really the crucial thing, and 2024 is the crucial year in relation to this. There's no question in my mind. The election, in fact, how much transparency is there in this election about the UFO file? The Apotham aspect that holds it back. As we talked about earlier today, there are elements in that machine at the top of the DoD and the intelligence community that will even strike down on the things that I'm saying in relation to this, because they're afraid of that secret leaking out. So the whistleblowers, the false whistleblowers they give us, and the false, UFO information that they give to Congress, so that they get these naive congressmen thinking that they're going to be involved in this great gold rush of the 21st century of breakaway technology without telling them where it comes from or how it operates. This is the nature of what we're up against. And I think it's a battle for the future. And I don't think the outcome is decided either way. But I can tell you this, the more transparency we get, that's the only hope that we have of a good outcome, in my opinion. The more information that's brought to bear. And there's a lot of information outside of government sources, so that disclosure doesn't actually have anything to do, in my opinion, with the government. Forget about the government or intel agencies when it comes to UFO disclosure. The UFO file is right where you find it in your own research.
That sounds like quite a future.
I would agree with you. Hopefully we'll both be there to see it.
And full transparency and everything.